Hi guys, welcome to our next lesson. So this lesson is going to be on the Articles of Confederation, which was the first Constitution of the United States. So in our previous lessons from the last week, we focused on the road to the Revolutionary War, and in that lesson, it ended with the writing and signing of the Declaration of Independence, and that was the document that actually created the United States. But once the United States came into existence, they needed some form of government to replace the one that they were leaving by leaving the King of England and Parliament. So they created something called the Articles of Confederation. So let's take a look at what it was. So for first off, for most Americans at this time when the articles were created, uh, for most Americans, their state came first and their country came second. So they didn't really think of themselves as Americans as much as they did think of themselves as Virginians or New Yorkers or Pennsylvanians. So they needed some form of government that was going to balance power between the states and the whole nation. And we call this is what is known as a Republican government. And what this means is that the citizens rule through elected representatives instead of everybody speaking for themselves, right? So they choose somebody to represent their views, and that's what a Republican government is. And this had existed previously in various areas of Europe, but the United States was different. The United States was much bigger and had a much more diverse population. And so people weren't sure how well this was going to work, right? And we're going to take a look at this map here. And you can see all the states that we were dealing with, right? We had the 13 colonies that became the 13 states, and you had a much wider population. You had people living all the way up here in the north in Maine, which at the time was part of the state of Massachusetts, and all the way down to Georgia. That was the United States at the time. So there was a lot of diversity in views of politics and also in people's heritage. So the Articles of Confederation is what was created to handle this division of power. Now it's important to note, let's not confuse the Articles of Confederation with the Confederate States of America or the Confederacy of the Civil War. Those are two totally separate things. So a confederation is simply a loose alliance between groups. It's like a friendship between political groups. And the Articles of Confederation were, well, they kind of struck a balance between the states and the national government. But they ended up giving most of the power to the states. And while the Declaration of Independence was signed and went into effect in 1776, it actually took about 5 years before the Articles of Confederation were agreed upon, and they didn't end up taking effect until March of 1781, which was almost at the end of the American Revolutionary War. So, what could this new government do under the Articles of Confederation? Well, they could declare war, they could make peace with foreign countries, they could sign treaties with foreign countries, they could borrow money as well, and they could also set standards for coins and weights and measures, which this literally means they could determine, for example, how long an inch was, how long a yard was, and things like that. And they could also establish a postal system. And this was really critical back then because that's how news was passed around and spread from state to state. And the other thing that the articles gave power to the government, the national government, was that they could also deal with Native Americans and make treaties with Native Americans. So if you look at the image here, it's kind of blurry on the left on this slide. Um, this is the original Articles of Confederation. It looks just like this. This is an exact image of what it looks like. And you can still see this in Washington, D.C. at the National Archives. So if you ever go to Washington, D.C., I really recommend going to the National Archives and seeing it for yourself. So what was accomplished under the Articles of Confederation? What were some of the positive effects? Well, there were a few good things that were accomplished. First of all was the Land Ordinance of 1785. And this created a plan for surveying Western lands, right? For scouting out Western lands. And these lands would later become states like Ohio and Michigan, Illinois, Indiana. And the surveyors that were sent out, they broke up the land into lots where people could live and where public school systems were able to be created. And the same thing happened with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This ended up dividing land that the United States owned into territories, and this created a process for territories to become states, right? It made it very clear what the residents of a territory had to do before they could actually become a state in the United States. And the important thing is that it noted that states would enter the Union as equals. So at no point would a territory be a colony like the United States had previously been colonies to Great Britain, right? Instead, when a state or when a territory became a state, they entered as the equal to states that already existed. And here is a map that gives you a breakdown of what the land ordinances of 1785 and 1787 were. And these lands, they were controlled, like I said, by the United States. They had gotten these lands back from the French in the French and Indian War that we learned about a couple weeks ago. And then with their success of the Revolutionary War in fighting it off Great Britain lost these territories. So the United States ended up gaining these territories from Great Britain. So now they had full control over these territories in the West. So the United States broke these territories up into units. And we see here on this map, it's kind of hard to see, it's kind of blurry. I had to blow up the image. But each square here is basically an acre, and they're about 6 square miles. That's how big they were in size. And they would break up these 6 square miles, these acres, into even smaller sections. And they would be sold, the land, the lots of land that were created would be sold to people, and they would be purposed for educational purposes, like I said, for land for public schools and for other things like, towns, creating towns. And there were some other pretty notable accomplishments under the Articles of Confederation as well, as we've just learned. But there were also many more problems. And some of these problems, they existed, they were clearly had existed from the outset, from the very beginning. So first of all, the Congress that was created by the Articles of Confederation, they didn't have the power to enact and collect taxes. So basically, there was no form of revenue for the government. They couldn't pay off their debts that they had incurred during the Revolutionary War because they didn't have the power to tax. And Congress also, the other problem was they couldn't regulate interstate trade or foreign trade. And what that meant was that each state, like New York, Virginia, Pennsylvania, each of those states, they basically could make up their own laws about trade. And that included trade between each other from state to state, But it also meant that states were signing their own trade deals with foreign nations. So, for example, if the United States wanted to trade with, let's say, France, France would have 13 different trade agreements with 13 different states. So imagine how confusing that would be for not only foreign nations that were wanting to trade with the United States, but imagine you, like, can you think of today when we have big companies that exist across state lines, like Walmart and Starbucks? Imagine if they had different trade agreements between each state, and each state had its own agreement with different countries. How would that affect business? Right? It would make business really difficult to conduct in the United States. So that was one big issue. And then another big issue under the Articles of Confederation was that each state also had only one vote in Congress, regardless of the population that they had in each state. So states like, for example, Virginia and New York, they had very large populations in the 1780s. And under this system, they had just as much power as, let's say, Rhode Island or Delaware or Georgia, which were states that had very little population back in the 1780s. Another big issue, a two-thirds majority, which means about 9 out of 13 states, had to agree with each other in order to pass a law, just a basic law. So it's not just a simple majority of 51% like we do nowadays for most laws. Instead, back then, it required about 66% of them to agree to pass a law. And it's even worse if they wanted to amend the Articles of Confederation, to add amendments to it. To be able to add an amendment, they had to unanimously approve. 13 out of 13 states had to agree with each other to amend the Articles of Confederation. Can you imagine how difficult that could be even today if we still had the Articles with 50 different states all having to agree on one thing? Good luck trying to find 13 out of 13 people to agree even on anything, even like their favorite topping on a slice of pizza, right? That's very difficult to get that many people to agree on just one thing. And then another big issue, there was no executive that existed under the Articles of Confederation. So there was nobody to enforce the laws. And that meant that Congress, under the Articles, they could pass a law, but then the question was, who is going to enforce it? Who's going to make sure that the states and that the citizens actually obeyed the laws? And well, we'll see what happens when the executive couldn't do that. But first, we have a picture here. This kind of sums up, it's a political cartoon. It kind of sums up the issues, the major issues with the Articles, right? You see here it says no power to enforce laws, no power to enforce treaties, no national court system, no power to raise an army, and no power to collect taxes. And you can see the ship here is the Articles of Confederation. It's basically a sinking ship. That's what the author is intending, the person who made this cartoon. So clearly there was a lot of issues with it, and this became a lot clearer when something called Shays' Rebellion happened. So Shays' Rebellion happened in 1786 and 1787. And this started when Daniel Shays, who was a farmer and a former soldier, he was a soldier in the Continental Army, so he fought against the British. He became very dismayed and upset and angry over the way he and his fellow farmers in Massachusetts and in New England were being treated. Um, he and many other farmers were, and his friends, they were losing their farms due to their inability to pay taxes. They couldn't pay their taxes that were passed by the state governments. And they thought that these taxes were way too high and too unfair. And so they went to the courthouses in their state where their farms were being repossessed, right? The courthouses were repossessing, taking control of their farms, their land, and they sold off the land to the highest bidder because they couldn't pay their taxes. And so the farmers, they started to burn down the courthouses. They started to scare off the judges. And all of a sudden, you have a rebellion on your hands. They shut down the courts in Massachusetts, and they started to march on Boston, Massachusetts, which was still one of the largest cities in the country. And this scared a lot of people, right? The farmers, the rebellion ended up heading to Springfield, Massachusetts, which is just west of Boston. It's in western Massachusetts. And eventually the rebellion, it did fall apart when they were met by a state militia that came out of Boston. So the rebellion was thwarted by a state militia, a state army group of soldiers. It wasn't the federal like US Army or US military that did this. It was a state one. And there were some battles, but not really any big battles. Only a couple of people ended up dying. Daniel Shays was arrested, but he was let go. And so, really, the major consequence to come from this event was there was more fear. More people were afraid of what could happen if people rebelled again, if people rebelled in protest like they had done in Shays' rebellion. So they were concerned. They were concerned too by the fact that the military response to Shays' army, his so-called army, was very slow. So they were afraid that other unhappy farmers and citizens might rise up and revolt. Some of the people who were afraid of this were George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison. And they said something needed to be done. So they ended up calling for a national meeting to deal with this issue and to deal with the other major problems that were arising in the country, other economic problems, political problems that were all caused under the Articles of Confederation. And so a meeting was set in Philadelphia in May of 1787 to try and resolve some of these issues. And they ended up meeting at the same building where the Declaration of Independence had been signed, at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And so in our next lesson, we're going to find out, more about what they did here at this constitutional convention. How did they resolve some of these issues? So let me know if you have any questions about this. Good luck on the assignment, and I'll see you in the next lesson.